If you are new here, this is where we come in every week. We invite an expert to speak about topics related to digital marketing and how to attract your target audience online. So the topics will be sent via emails and shared in our Facebook group, Skyrocket Blog Traffic. So be sure to be on the mailing list. You can also catch up on the earlier sessions, which are jam-packed with a lot of actionable takeaways. So without further ado, I'm super excited to be here with Anna. We connected like a couple months ago, and she was one of the reasons why I started this expert session. And so she's going to share everything about creating memorable stories and about her journey with storytelling. And so I'll let her take over the floor and introduce herself and share her insights.
Hi, guys. Thanks so much for attending. I really appreciate it. I'm just going to dive right in because I know we are sticking to a quick time clock here. So how to create memorable stories. A little bit about me first. My name is Anna Codina. I've been a content marketer and consultant for the last 10 years now, over 10 years actually. I work with brands like Evernote, Wildlife Fund, and I'm currently one of the go-to consultants for Adobe. I focus a lot on storytelling, content optimization, content marketing, as well as good stories. Basically, everything I do revolves around that, as well as the user journey. So to get started, I would love to go into today's agenda. So we'll cover what is storytelling, why is it important, what's considered a good story, and how to tell a good story. So Wikipedia describes storytelling as the social and cultural activity of sharing stories, sometimes with improvisation, theatrics, or embellishment. I like to think storytelling is about connection for most of us. Unless you were born like a superhuman, verbal language is pretty much what we learned first, and then we learned how to write. This means our brain is hardwired for narrative. If we rewind a little bit and examine history for a moment, before the days of the pen and paper, our hunter and gatherer ancestors were travelers. And when things got cold and food dried up, we moved locations and we moved with the seasons. And as a traveling and trading society that didn't know how to read or write, the only way to create an idea that persisted from one day to another and spread from one person to another was to somehow make it memorable in our minds. So storytelling is basically a sequence of events, and it invites the listener to put themselves in the role of experiencing those events. The human experience is immense. While some might be, off to war and another might be, home gardening with a bunch of alpacas, our experience is immense, but our range of emotion is not. So at the core, and I am sort of simplifying it a little bit, but at the core, we experience anger, sadness, happiness, guilt, shame, and fear. The type of experiences we see and live through might be completely different, but at the core, we all feel similar things. By sharing our stories, we are able to connect our diverse experiences with root emotions that anybody can relate to. So why is it important? So if we fast forward to today's time, the human brain hasn't quite evolved as fast as our technology has. I can tell people I'm in marketing or I'm a content marketer, and not everyone is going to know what that means. I once told somebody that I was a copywriter, and he asked about a copyright infringement policies. So no, I had to explain that, I write content, like I'm a writer that writes copy for a living. But that basically highlights the problem that we are experiencing. Like when we've been in an industry for so long, we incorrectly assume people like know what your title means. And this is like a perfect example, red. Did you know everyone here sees the color red differently? This was something that I learned when I was a graphic designer. I can show you a red color, and some of you will see it as pink. Some of you will see it as more orange. Some of you will see it as a lighter red than this red. Our perception of the color red is different to our eye because the number of cones, aka photoreceptors, in the human retina is not constant. All this to say, the way I process data or information is going to be vastly different than the way you process data, right? So if we keep this in mind, if we're not even seeing the same thing, the chances are we're not hearing the same thing. And when we hear something, we are usually processing it under our context and experience and assumptions. So we sometimes unknowingly fill in the blanks when we hear something. So just take a look at this graphic I created here. Okay. So here, when two people are speaking to each other, we have two opportunities to misunderstand one another. Me to you, you to me. When there's four people, in a room, there's 12 ways we can misinterpret the information. And when there's 8 people in the room, there's about 56 ways we can mishear something. So that's quite a lot. No wonder, if you're in very large organizations, or if you're in a large group of friends, for example, it can almost feel like you're playing a game of like telephone sometimes, trying to understand who's saying what. Our brains respond to content by looking for the story to make sense out of the experience. I'm in tech and I've been in tech for a really long time. But even with this background, I've stumbled upon somebody saying that they're in like an AI driven data governance platform. Like that's what they did. And, I understand what those words mean, but I had no clue, like absolutely no clue what these providers did and how it was relevant to me. And that's the problem with business. We say things and we just assume people would understand. Like I'm a copywriter. How many people have told me that they do SEO? And I'm like, okay, but what part? And they go, everything. I do everything. I'm from the websites, the Google ads, like the optimizations. To me, it's like, okay, great. But what does that actually mean? Like, I get what those words mean, but how does it actually help me? And a lot of people tell me what they do, but they don't connect the dots, or they leave it up to me to fill in the blanks or to assume certain parts of your career that may or may not be true or false. So context matters. For example, an underwriter in the insurance industry is way different from an underwriter in the real estate industry. Same name, same title, different occupations. In business, you don't want people filling in a false narrative about you, even if it's a good narrative, because it means they'll have expectations you'll never be able to meet. So at one point, I surveyed my audience and asked them how many of them thought they were good storytellers. 81% of them said they thought they were good at storytelling. Yet when I asked what makes them stand out from the competition, only one person actually wrote something compelling. Everything else was very generic, like, I care about my work. I'm not a big agency. My products are well made. I'm positive. It's like, if I were to ask the same questions to your competitor, I really don't think they would say, oh, I'm different because like my products aren't well made and I'm like miserable to work with. They'd say the exact same thing you'd be saying. So it's kind of like a baseline standard expectation. Like when I buy from you, I want it to be good. And I'd also like you to be kind of nice about it. So based on that alone, you're not standing out. I don't want, I'm not going to go down like a huge rabbit hole on how to stand out from your competition. But typically, in order to stand out, you have to be providing somebody else something no one else in your industry is doing. That can kind of look like supporting a nonprofit with your proceeds, or some kind of customization or personalization on how delivering your product, perhaps the type of culture your business has. And, call me biased, but your brand story also plays a huge factor from how you stand out versus how do you not. For example, if you look at Coca-Cola versus Pepsi, during Christmas time, everybody remembers the polar bear and the Coca-Cola ad, but, Pepsi, not so much. So their storytelling ability is sort of lackluster compared to Coca-Cola, yet they sell the same product. And I get it. Standing out is tough, and it has to be something that makes your customer turn their head. And that takes conscious and diligent effort to create, which is no surprise to me that a majority of my questionnaire participants had a hard time finding the right kind of people to work with and to sell to. A lot of them had trouble converting their audience into paying customers. So why are stories important? You basically bridge the gap between what is theoretical and customers' assumptions to what is tangible, to what is real, basically. So you use stories to clarify what it is you're thinking. Stories are all about collaboration and connection. And stories are the common ground that allows people to communicate, overcome defenses, overcome our differences. Remember, it comes back to bridging the experience to at least one of those 6 core emotions. And that helps bring a better understanding. So we can bring a very diverse set of experiences to the table by telling our story. And I know diversity is a hot topic right now. There's a huge subsection of people that feel marginalized. They don't feel heard. They don't feel like they matter. And we want to tell our diverse stories so that more people can understand that they're not alone. But there's an art to telling a good story, no matter how diverse it might be. It doesn't always move the needle in creating passion and understanding. In fact, it can alienate people and cause more rifts because you seem so tone deaf to the situation if you're sharing a story that's not related to the context. So for example, if you are able to talk about grief in a way that makes me understand, because I've also experienced the same type of emotion, you're describing. It doesn't matter if you're crying about your dog passing away or the fact that you got fired. I can empathize with you and I can bleed with you because I understand you. Versus if you're in grief because your goldfish died and you're kind of doing this like, woe is me, I'm going to have a superficial reaction to that because I cannot relate to your goldfish dying and the pain that might cause, but I can relate to the pain of your grief. But in order for me to really, really do that, there needs to be like a story to connect that grief. So stories basically give you a deeper and more meaningful reaction, no matter what the event. So this brings me to the next section and what's considered a good story. We think storytelling needs to have like a grand gesture, like introduction and middle and end. It needs to have an antagonist, gunfights and airplanes flying above in order for us to really drive the point home. But really, a good story just needs to be memorable. And sometimes the shorter stories are the most memorable. If you do a quick Google search on how to tell a good story, for example, you kind of get bombarded by a lot of information. You can get into the weeds of like character development or understanding the art of timing and tonality and stuff like that. But I'm not going to overcomplicate something if we don't even know the basics. And, all those advanced tactics of how to really suck somebody into your story, that comes only with better practice, right? So we all want like the secret to the foundation of a good story. But basically, my benchmark is, will your audience remember it? Will they relate to it? And will they take action on it? A good story has all three of these things in place, and I'll talk about each, but I'm all about small successes. So after today's workshop, I just want you to start somewhere, like small, and just try to make your story memorable. In fact, if you have a good story, then everything else becomes stackable. Like just because you tell one good story doesn't mean you need to throw all your other stories out the window. I just want to make a note that sometimes it takes more than one story to get your point across and explain what it is that you do and how you serve people. So getting back to the foundational three pieces here, to something memorable. We have goldfish memories. So if we want to get good at storytelling, it comes to thinking back if your participant or your friend or your customer, can they replay back what you're saying? I'll show an example of what this looks like in a little bit, but that's usually a good gauge. If your story is 5 paragraphs long, chances are they're not going to be able to replay it back exactly the way you said it. They're probably going to summarize it for you. The next component to making a story, a good story, is relatability. The easiest way to do this in the beginning is to talk to somebody one-on-one. And so if you're trying to make a story relatable, I suggest that doing that first before creating a multifaceted story for a group of people or for a passive consuming scrolling audience. Again, in our next section, I'll show you exactly what this looks like. But usually to make a good story relatable, you want to ask them a couple of questions first to see where they're at before you dive into whatever product or offering that you might have. So what you're looking for when you're asking them questions is to find out their core emotion and listen for undertones of that. And then once you get a better idea of all their core emotions from your target audience, you can then take that and make it more scalable to a larger scrolling and passive audience. For the most part, only close friends will give you their core emotion right off the bat. Most people share surface level stuff. So, for example, if somebody says, I think I'm getting fired, the core emotion there is saying there's an art to digging through that, and it's not always intuitive. But once you discover their core emotion, you then want to share a story that connects their pain to a life experience you had or you know about to build deeper connection. And then the final part of a good story is making somebody take action on it. People can listen to stories for days and go, wow, I really learned something. But chances are the person hearing your story to do something about it. How many times have you given your friends advice and they just go off and do the exact opposite thing? You want them to buy from you, hire you, listen to you, whatever it is. You want something to happen. And you don't want them to walk away having them feel good, right? Terrible about themselves. So for this, the action part, I always ask myself, what do I want this person to actually do at the end of our interaction? What's the key lesson here? Do I need to motivate them to make a difficult decision? Do I need to encourage them because they're feeling depressed? Do I want them to embrace the unknown? The biggest takeaway in my questionnaire was my audience wanted to make more money. Yes, we can say I want my future clients to pay me like the big bucks, but no one's just going to give you more money without a reason. So you need to break that down and dive deeper into that reason. There might be multiple reasons why, for example, somebody would want to make more money. And this is why I think this is one of the pitfalls to storytelling, or why people fail at storytelling. It's very me centric. He should pay me more because I deserve it is not a good reason for, or like a good catalyst to a good story. Just like saying, I'm a positive person is not a reasonable argument for standing out from your competition, right? So if you want your client or your boss to pay you more money, it needs to be externally focused and focused on them. Why would they give you more money? Because you're solving them a problem no one else can solve. You're the most qualified person to solve that problem. You cannot be replaced. That's very me centric. But if that's the case, what story can you use to drive that point home so that it benefits your boss to giving you more money? So you kind of have to step out of your me focus and really think about ways your boss will remember it, relate to it, and take action on it. Ideally, by the end of your interaction, you want them to think that you're the only solution for them. And you then work backwards on how to make that happen. You want to figure out what the ultimate message is and what your action step is. I just want to end on one final note for this segment. So many people aren't sure what's a good story to tell. They don't know if it's too personal or off base. And these are totally legitimate concerns. You do have to tread carefully sometimes, especially starting out. This is why it's important to flesh out your stories beforehand rather than on the spot. For example, I listened to a woman, a very successful businesswoman who made multi-million dollars in her business and is now coaching people on how to grow their businesses in a particular niche. Sounds super promising. She sounded good. But when I listened to her on this podcast, she was an absolute train wreck. She talked about her origin story, which involved her being arrested for domestic violence. And that was just like the tip of the iceberg. And I understand it's a part of her story. Not all of us have perfect stories, but there's a time and a place for it. And you can even turn bad things that have happened to you or that you've done into a redemption story or even into an underdog story. There's no judgment there. But the way she presented it was so on the fly that it made me not want to hire a domestic abuser as my next business coach, for example. In business, we have to repel a certain type of person to attract another type of person. But I'm not quite sure what kind of people she was trying to attract with the stories that she was telling. So that's just something to keep in mind. Write them out, flesh them out, put a conscious effort into it, and have a goal. Does this story meet my goal of being seen as a respected individual? Am I somebody that somebody would want to hire? These are the stories that we want to put in the forefront. And then we have redemption stories or like overcoming the problem that you might have experienced and that other people can relate to, and you can build upon that. So the next part is how to tell a good story. Based on time, I'm just going to share a couple of mini examples of what this looks like, but following the framework of memorable, relatable, and actionable. We can pull stories from our own life, which is easiest in the beginning, but you can also break empathy the fastest if you do it wrong. It's the easiest thing to do, but it's also the easiest way to kind of screw up. We can pull stories from people we know in our life, our client success stories, friends, family. We can also pull from culture, such as resources, books, whatever external forces that might inspire us at the moment. So we have a lot of stories to work with. I call these the personal, the inner circle, and the third party stories. Just let me set the stage on what would be a good story to tell. So if somebody is saying, I think I'm going to get fired, a lot of people just dive into giving advice on how to not get fired, or how they're a great and hardworking person. And like the organization that wants to fire you, screw them. A lot of people go directly to trying to problem solve. But before we even do that, we need to stop and think. And it gets better with practice, but we need to understand the core emotion of that statement. Number one, what is the person really saying underneath that? And number two, what is it that they want to happen ideally? So ideally, in a situation like this, we want to ask follow-up questions to confirm, because everybody's different, but the core emotion they have, usually when they say, I think I'm going to get fired, is I'm very scared. And the end result or the core action item they want is, I don't want to get fired. The thing is, no matter what we do, we can't control whether someone gets fired or not. So for the sake of this story, our action item is to make them feel okay about getting fired, that life will be okay, and it's not the end of the world. So to recap, I think I'm getting fired. You ask questions to confirm the core emotion and their end result, aka the desire. And you tell a story that bridges the core emotion. And the stories that you can use are basically yourself, inner circle stories, or third-party stories. So for example, if a friend of yours is getting fired or is worried about getting fired, this would be a story that you could relate back to them feeling scared and feeling like they want to try and hold on to whatever control that they're trying to hold on to. Of course, we can't control that. So we're trying to help them embrace the unknown a little bit. So this is the story I would share. I was listening to a World War II veteran. He's still alive today, believe it or not. He was telling this crazy story about how 1 week he's there in the heart of it, fighting the Nazis, shooting Nazi planes right out of the air, having bullets fly by him and almost hitting his ear. It's very intense. And as I was listening to this story, I was like, my God, this man is like incredibly brave. If I was in his position, I'd be pretty scared, not knowing what will happen, if I will be living or if I'm dying. It seems like he was just taking it in stride. Like he was just saying it as if it was any Wednesday morning. And then he said something pretty interesting. It kind of made me think about what my friend is going through, AKA the person about to get fired. He said, despite all this, 3 weeks later, the war is over. He was going back home and he didn't know what to expect because he had left when he was 17. And now that the war is over, it felt like a different world. He had grown as a person. He's been away from home for several years. And he found himself, again, keep in mind, he was just in war 3 weeks ago. He finds himself sitting in a room about to get interviewed for a new job. And he said he had never been more scared in his life. And it's funny how things like that work out. We have these fight or flight responses that activate whenever we're faced with the unknown. You're faced with the unknown right now because you don't know if you'll have a job tomorrow. You may be fired. But if he can shoot Nazis one day and then get the job the next, it really speaks to how adaptable the human condition is. You're not really afraid of being fired. You're afraid of what's out there, the unknown. And the good news about all of that is that we can prepare for it because you're an incredibly qualified person for the job and you're working for a bunch of insane people, So that's one example of how you can tie in a third party story, for example, into somebody's core emotion, which is fear, and into somebody's desire. To wrap up, I have one final story and it's I need a bigger audience. I get this question quite a bit. And I've asked enough questions to know the core emotion and the core desire here. The core emotion is shame. Out of the 6 core emotions that we had talked about earlier, the core desire here is to make more money. And the story I usually like to share is one that Conan O'Brien actually was talking to Dana Carvey about. Dana calls it comedian compression. And the idea is that the smaller the room, the better the laughs, because laws of physics. People can feel the energy and explosion of laughter every time something goes right. When it's a small room, you can feel the power and it just rattles around. The same is true when you're in a small, compact room. The energy is contained in this small ball and it creates such sparks. The more energy a tight confinement, the more explosion it can be. It has to go somewhere, basically. However, Dana was saying that the death of a comedian is when they walk into a large stage hall for a charity event or a conference room. Like the room is so big and the ceilings are so high that when there's laughter, it only feels like it's happening in pockets, which means there's more room for the energy, AKA the laughter, to escape. In my experience, the same is true in business. We're told that everyone under the sun, we need to have a large audience in order for us to get to where we want to go. These are just like vanity numbers in my experience. Like, what's the point of having 100K followers if no one buys from you? It's kind of dumb. Instead, what we really want is a core of 200 people on your email list. And like, who cares if only 5 people are following you on Instagram when all 200 people are following you and paying for your service? FOMO is super overrated. It distracts you. Like that big room, you're pushing all this money and energy into a big room that you only get pockets of laughter from. What you need is comedian compression. The smaller the room, the bigger the punch, the easier it is for things to just go right. And so these are the kinds of stories you want to flesh out to address any objections your client might have. Think of some of like the top 5 ones that you tend to get. Like, I don't think I can afford it. I'm not ready to buy yet. whatever it might be, depending on your industry, there might be unique specific challenges. Like, I'm such a busy mom, I don't have time to cook. These are some of the common objections you might receive. And then think about some of the stories or some of the emotions these people are experiencing. Think about some of their core desires at the end of the day, and craft these stories to target specific objections for your client. And if you'd like help crafting these stories, or you just like to connect with me, feel free to reach out. Here's my information. And that's the end of my talk.
That's really speedy. But I really wanted to get into one specific example to make everything that you teach more actionable, if that's okay. So let's say, like you mentioned, someone who's a busy mom, but she wants to achieve this goal of hers that you're solving, that your product or service is solving. So then how do you identify the desire and the emotion, and how do you craft? Can you give an example of crafting a story that would really connect with her?
Yeah. So keep in mind that we have 6 core emotions. That's simplifying things a little bit. But just to recap, our 6 emotions are anger, sadness, happiness, guilt, shame, and fear, right? So ideally, what you want to do is talk to your core audience, talk to the mom that's super busy, and just ask her questions. And you can even ask her, like, how does this make you feel that you can't work out and you're always super stressed? And what would you like to happen at the end of that? By getting more of these stories, you can actually make it scalable. And then based on that, let's say she has fear that she won't be able to lose the weight. And that fear can stem from not being able to live a long life and see her children grow up or her grandchildren grow up, or she's missing out on a lot of fun activities. She doesn't want to go outside to the beach and hang out with her friends because she feels subconscious in that bikini suit and things like that. We want to kind of connect that story of the desire is for her to feel good again, right?
Mm-hmm.
She has fear that she's missing out on life. The desire is to feel good again. We connect it with, all right, in 20 years from now, let's paint that story. Let's paint of what that would look like for you. You can share a story of how one of your clients went through a transformation. She was exactly where this person was, single mom, 3 kids. And you can go deep into the story. Like, Janet had 3 kids, Bobby, James, and Connor. And now that she's lost all this weight, she's been able to spend more time, even participate as a coach for her son's football game. And these are how you kind of connect everything together, by seeing what it would resemble or relate back to something memorable, something relatable, and something actionable. So that is kind of in a nutshell for that particular example. Obviously, you want to kind of write that out more and flesh it out more, and then bring out these stories as you go through this discovery process, because each client or each industry is a little bit different.
Yeah.
I already have a whole questionnaire that I ask my clients on, and it can be quite encompassing. Usually I'll spend like an hour with them, and I will ask them like anywhere from like 35 to 50 questions based on what they're doing. And I'll think about it, flesh out the story more appropriately based on where they are and what kind of stories that they would want to share. And it also falls in within those 3 circles of influence, right? Their own personal story. Maybe the coach or the fitness person was a mom or is a mom and got really motivated, so we can share a personal success story. Maybe her clients are somebody's that her ideal client can relate to, or even pulp culture, like celebrities who have lost weight and what that's done for them, basically helping them live a more healthy life where they no longer have to suffer from diabetes or whatever sort of health complications come from somebody who isn't super happy with their body or with how they're feeling. Is that helpful?
Yeah, for sure. So then, okay, like you mentioned, to share a personal story, is there a method that you share in a way that it's not just text to you, but it's something that somebody else, like your target audience, can connect? Is there certain features of the story that you would offer?
Yeah. So my 3 frame pillar pieces is memorable, relatable, and actionable, right? So basically, the first step I would suggest is just make it memorable. If somebody can repeat the story, then you've got something good, right? And that takes practice, of course. But usually if you have like a 5-paragraph story that you've written in a blog post, that might be a little too long. Ideally, we want something that's maybe a paragraph or 2 paragraphs if you're doing it in writing format. If it's in a verbal format, it's a lot easier to remember, but we don't want pages and pages of a story about your client, because at the end of the day, somebody's only going to take a few nuggets of that and replay it, right? So my suggestion, if you want to take some of these stories and know whether it's right, like if it works or not, is are your clients remembering it for a later time? Are they trying to bring that story up and at another time, or is it like sitting in their subconscious at the end of the day? Before
Thank you
it
very
crashes?
much. I hope it was helpful for anyone who tuned in today. Awesome. Yeah, thanks for your time today, everyone. Hope to see you in the next session.
Yes, thank you.
All right, see ya.
Bye.